June 24, 1941. A dirt road in western Lithuania, running back from a bridgehead on the Dubysa River, 75 kilometers northwest of Kaunas. 2 days into the invasion of the Soviet Union, the 6th Panzer Division has thrown its tanks across the water and is racing for Leningrad. Everything the men on the far bank need, fuel, ammunition, food, has to come up this one road. And sitting in the middle of it, engine idling, turret slowly turning, is a single Soviet tank. It is enormous. A slab-sided box the height of a house sits on top of it, and out of that box points a gun far too big for any tank the Germans have ever seen. 12 supply trucks are already burning behind it. A German anti-tank battery is unlimbering in the trees. Over the next 24 hours, the men of a full Panzer division will throw everything they own at this one machine, and for a full day they will fail. This is the story of the tank that should not have worked on the day it refused to die. To understand why one tank could do this, you have to understand what the Germans were carrying and what they were not. On the 22nd of June, 1941, 3 million men crossed the Soviet frontier in the largest land invasion in history. In the north, Army Group North drove for the Baltic and Leningrad, and its armored fist was the 4th Panzer Group under General Erich Hoepner. The spearhead was the 6th Panzer Division, and the 6th Panzer went to war mostly in a Czech-built tank called the Panzer 35T. It was light, it was reliable, and it carried a 37mm gun. Against Polish and French armor in the years before, that gun had been enough. The German crews had learned to trust it. Then, near a town called Raseiniai, they met the tank Stalin had been building in secret, and the 37mm gun stopped meaning anything at all. The shells struck the Soviet armor and bounced. Gun crews watched their rounds spark off the front of these machines and skitter away into the fields. The heavier 50mm guns did no better. In one action, Soviet heavy tanks simply drove forward into an anti-tank position and crushed the guns flat under their tracks, crews and all. The Germans had a name for the moment when a weapon they had trusted turned out to be useless. They called it the tank fright. On the road to Leningrad in the summer of 1941, an entire army caught it at once. The machine at the center of the story was the KV-2, and it was one of the strangest tanks ever sent into battle. The KV name came from Kliment Voroshilov, one of Stalin's marshals. The KV-1 was already a monster, a 50-ton heavy tank with armor thick enough to shrug off anything the Germans fielded. But the KV-2 was built to answer a different question. In the winter of 1939, the Red Army had thrown itself against the concrete bunkers of the Finnish Mannerheim Line and bled. Ordinary tank guns could not crack reinforced concrete. So Soviet engineers took the KV-1 hull and dropped an artillery piece onto it. They needed something that could drive up to a bunker and blow it open. What they built was a howitzer on tracks. The big turret KV was rushed into the field before it was ready. In February of 1940, with the Winter War still raging, the first prototypes were sent straight to the front and driven up against the Finnish fortifications at Suma. There they did exactly what they had been designed to do. The great howitzer fired on the bunkers at close range, and Finnish anti-tank guns hammered the tanks in return and could not stop them. The armor held. The concept was proven in the 1 week of combat the war had left to give it, and the tank went into production. By the time it mattered, on the roads of Lithuania, the KV-2 was still a machine that had barely been tested. The gun was a 152mm M10 howitzer, and it was the largest weapon mounted on any tank in the world in 1941. It threw a high-explosive shell weighing 52 kilograms, better than 115 pounds of steel and explosive, or a special 40-kilogram round designed to smash concrete. The shell and its propellant charge came in 2 separate pieces, each so heavy that the tank needed 2 loaders working together just to feed the gun. That is why the KV-2 carried a crew of 6, one more than almost any other tank of the war. Against fortifications, the gun was devastating. Against another tank, A single direct hit did not need to punch through the armor. The blast alone could tear a turret off its ring or kill a crew through solid steel. To carry that gun, the designers built a turret like nothing else on the battlefield. It was a tall, flat-sided steel box, and it made the KV-2 stand 3¼ meters high, taller than a man standing on another man's shoulders. The armor ran from 75 millimeters at the hull front to as much as 110 millimeters on the turret. In 1941, that was effectively immune to every standard German anti-tank gun. Underneath sat a V2 diesel engine of around 600 horsepower and a 52-ton hull. The whole thing was protected, heavily armed, and almost impossible to kill from the front. It was also deeply flawed, and the crews knew it. The turret was so heavy and so badly balanced that it would only traverse reliably when the tank sat on level ground. Park on a slope, and 6 men could barely crank the gun around. The height that made it so imposing also made it a target you could see from a kilometer away. The engine and transmission, built for a lighter machine, were dragged to pieces by the extra weight, and breakdowns were constant. Just over 200 KV-2s were ever built, and in the chaos of 1941, most of them were lost not to German shells but to broken final drives, empty fuel tanks, and crews forced to abandon a tank that would not move. The KV-2 was a weapon that could dominate a battlefield for exactly as long as it could stay running and stay level. On a straight dirt road, standing still, it was in its element. The tanks that shocked the 6th Panzer Division belonged to the Soviet 2nd Tank Division, commanded by Major General Yegor Salyankin. It was part of the 3rd Mechanized Corps, and it was thrown into a desperate counterattack around Raseiniai to stop the German bridgeheads over the Dubysa. On the 23rd of June, Salyankin's heavy tanks, KV-1s and KV-2s together, rolled straight over a German battle group and kept going. German gunners fired at point-blank range and watched their rounds bounce. It was in the middle of this counterattack that one KV, separated from the rest, found the supply road behind the northern bridgehead and sat down on it. Which tank it was, exactly, is a question that has never been fully answered. The German officer who wrote the most famous account, Erhard Raus, called it a KV-1. Most historians, looking at the evidence, believe it was a KV-2. When the tank was finally opened, 6 bodies were found inside, and 6 was the crew of the KV-2, not the 5 of the KV-1. The men carried no papers that survived, and the records of their unit were lost in the retreat. To this day, we do not know their names, and we are not entirely sure which model of tank they died in. What the Germans recorded is what it did. The tank cut the road on the 24th of June, and the effect was immediate. The bridgehead across the Dubysa was suddenly starving. A column of trucks bringing up fuel and ammunition came down the road and drove straight into the KV's gun. 12 of them were destroyed. The German battle group commander sent forward a battery of 4 50mm anti-tank guns, the best he had, to deal with the problem. The gunners crept to within a few hundred meters and opened fire. The tank turned its enormous turret toward them and destroyed all 4 guns, one after another, killing the crews before they could do any real harm. The rounds that struck the KV left nothing but bright scars on the armor. By now the Germans understood they were dealing with something their standard weapons could not touch, so they brought up the one gun that could. The 88mm flak gun was designed to shoot down aircraft, but its long, high-velocity barrel made it the deadliest tank killer in the German arsenal. A crew towed one to within about 730 meters and began to set it up, carefully, quietly, hoping to get the first shot. The tank saw them. Before the 88 could fire an effective round, the KV put a shell into the gun position and wrecked it. The most feared anti-tank weapon in the German army had been destroyed by a howitzer built to knock down bunkers. Night came and the tank still held the road. German combat engineers volunteered to finish it by hand. In the dark, they crawled up to the hull and placed demolition charges against the tracks and the flank. The charges went off. When the smoke cleared, the tank was still there, still able to fight, its crew still alive inside. The engineers may have damaged a track, but they had not stopped it. For a second time, the men of a Panzer division had come at this machine with everything they had, and it had beaten them. On the morning of the 25th, the Germans finally organized the attack that worked, and it took a trick to do it. They brought up a group of the light Panzer 35T tanks and sent them circling and firing, deliberately drawing the KV's attention, making that heavy turret crank around to chase them. While the crew was distracted, a second 88 was brought into position behind the tank. It fired into the KV from the rear where the crew could not see it, and this time the shells went through. Several hits struck home. Then German engineers climbed onto the hull and pushed grenades through the holes the 88 had torn in the armor. As they did it, witnesses saw the turret begin to move again. The crew was still trying to fight. The grenades ended it. When the Germans finally opened the tank, they found the 6 men who had held an army for a day. The officers who had spent that day trying to kill them were, by their own account, moved by what they had seen. The crew of that single tank was buried where they fell with military honors by the same men they had fought. Years later, in 1965, the remains were moved to the Soviet military cemetery at Raseiniai. For all its drama, the stand of the lone KV changed nothing about the battle around it. This is the hard truth the story usually leaves out. While that one tank held the road, the rest of the Soviet counterattack was falling apart. The 3rd Mechanized Corps ran out of fuel. Salyankin's 2nd Tank Division was surrounded and destroyed, and Salyankin himself was killed. Within days, the armored strength of the entire northwestern front had been shattered, and the road to Leningrad lay open. One tank on one road could not save an army that had run dry of gasoline. The Germans buried the crew, cleared the wreck, and kept driving east. But the shock those tanks delivered outlived the battle by years. Up and down the German chain of command, officers were writing the same thing in their reports. The enemy has tanks we cannot stop. The 37mm gun was finished, the 50mm was not enough, and even the mighty 88 had to be dragged into position and fired from behind to do the job. The KV and its faster cousin, the T-34, forced the German army into a scramble for heavier guns and heavier armor. That scramble ran straight to the drawing boards that produced the Tiger and the Panther, the tanks that would define the second half of the war. The machines that terrified the Wehrmacht in 1941 are the reason those famous German cats exist at all. The KV-2 itself did not last. It was too tall, too heavy, too slow, and too temperamental for the war it found itself in, and production ended in October of 1941 as the factory was torn up and shipped east ahead of the German advance. Fewer than the number of tanks in a single strong division were ever built, and most were gone within a year. As a weapon of war, it was close to a failure. And yet, the picture that survives is the one from that road in Lithuania. A machine that should not have worked, a gun built for a different war, and 6 men whose names we will never know, in a tank whose model we still argue about, holding a dirt road against a Panzer division for a single day in the first week of the largest invasion the world has ever seen. They lost. Everything around them was already lost. They fought anyway until the last man could no longer turn the gun. The Germans who killed them dug them a grave and stood over it, because even the enemy understood they had seen something worth remembering.